Then I'll call to order the meeting of the Finance Committee for August 22nd. That seems loud. Oh. Are there any changes, additions to the agenda? Okay, in which case I'll move the agenda be approved as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Looking to the minutes of the June 27th meeting of the Finance Committee, are there errors or omissions? Seeing none, I'll move the minutes be adopted as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving then into the staff reports, item D1, the 2017 financial report.
Good afternoon, Your Worship, members of the Finance Committee. Just quickly before we head into the first topic of this afternoon's discussion, I did want to sort of set the tone a little bit for this afternoon. So this is the last Finance Committee of this Council's term, and today's topics really do reflect the work that Council has been doing over the past 4 years with their financial leadership. The long-term financial strategy and the policies that you'll be considering this afternoon all reflect Council's work in the area of financial arena, and they also culminate in solid financial legacy that through your 4 years you've put together for the future Council. So I just wanted to open the last finance meeting with that to sort of set the tone.
Thank you. And just before you move on, I want to acknowledge that all the heavy lifting has been done by you and your colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. And here's Rick for that.
Mr. Irwin.
Good afternoon, Your Worship and members of the Finance Committee. I'm here this afternoon to once again provide an update on year-to-date results, this time as of June 30th. There's a full agenda today, so I'll be brief because not too much has changed since I was here just at the end of June. As usual, overall, the majority of the year-to-date variances are due to timing. Many are projected to realign with budget throughout the rest of the year. A couple of items, though, the administration would like to highlight. ATCO and Fortis franchise fees continue to trend better than budget, as I reported last time, primarily, again, due to the colder winter, and the higher base rates are following through through this year. The combined increase of the two right now is $234,000 at the end of June. One addition that wasn't highlighted in March is planning permit revenue is now trending better than budget. This is thanks to several large projects and the general level of development that's going on in the community right now. The increase to budget is approximately $145,000 at the end of June, but it's grown to $210,000 at the end of July. So I think that's the trends keeping going. And lastly, year-to-date payroll savings is around $350,000 so far at the end of June versus the budget assumption of around $200,000. Administration will continue to track through it the rest of the year. That's about it for highlights. Your agenda package includes service area specific details by department, and operating results at the end of June do not suggest any action required from the Finance Committee. And in conclusion, we ask that the Finance Committee accept the year-to-date financial report as of June 30th for information. And that's it.
Thank you very much. And it's interesting to note that, as you've just highlighted, those 3 or 4 different differences amount to well, close to $500,000 difference in the budget on the positive side. On the positive side, which is much better than the reverse.
Yep, that's right.
I have a few questions from various sections of the report, and I expect others do as well. Just looking to page 7 of the agenda, which is the summary of all units. So I have a couple of questions, and they may be related, but one is around borrowing costs. So help me understand why the borrowing costs are so much lower than expected.
I'm going to refer you to pages 24 and 25. Solid waste services and water utility. Basically, 2 sets of drawings. So on page 24, the debt for the collection vehicle was budgeted to be taken last December, We didn't take it, so we didn't have a June payment. We'll be taking it this coming December, so we saved that June payment. It'll be added on to next year. And then on page 25, the same thing.
Okay.
All of the debt wasn't taken. Again, was due to timing.
So it's really just deferred debt,
It's deferred.
borrowing cost.
Exactly.
Oops, thank you. Councillor Krausert?
Worship. Thank you, Mr. Irwin, for the presentation. The first question is, when are you ever not brief? You're always concise.
I try.
Yeah. But secondly, seriously, this is just an idea throwing out there, and I was wondering what you or Ms. Van Campina think about it. With development permits, they're trending well right now. And what I think I've observed, and we all know, is that development goes through this feast and famine type cycle, right? Where it's down and all of a sudden we don't have enough work for everyone, and then maybe we're cutting down on people, and then it starts picking up, but even before the money starts rolling in, we've got to hire people and we've got to, you know, ask for more money or anything. Is it something that could be considered that that some of the surplus, if there is one from development, could be earmarked to help smooth out that line in the development department? Doesn't go up and down and get used elsewhere? Because it seems to me that if it gets used elsewhere, then it results in potentially, you know, a tax increase down the road to cover that.
It certainly could. I mean, that could be part of year-end surplus distribution. Yeah. In the past few years, the quote-unquote surplus in planning has gone to economic development, or to PAH actually. Yeah. So could it be done like that through a transfer to reserve? Yes. Yeah. I mean, we try to be conservative in budgeting planning revenues because, again, you don't know, unless you do know what's really coming in.
That's the thing.
And, you know, look at trends and things like that.
Well, I mean, it's by its nature, it's going to go like this because it follows the trends of the market and whatnot. I just was wondering if there was something that we could put in to help smooth the road, because that seems to be a department that will go up and down. You need more people at certain times, and anyway, I just put it out there.
Yeah, could be done. I mean, in essence, we kind of did that.
I won't be able to make that suggestion at year end, so I just parking it right now.
We've kind of did that this year. Actually, we brought in, you know, things changed in planning. We did bring in money from reserve to offset the additional resources. Yeah. So the money that went into reserve from last year's surplus kind of do that.
If it gets earmarked, then it's a little bit more palatable. It doesn't feel like, oh, we're taking from reserves again. But if there happens to be sort of like this slush fund that we know, because we know it's going to go up and down. We know we're going to need it 5 years from now, and then we won't need it, and then we'll need it again. You know, so
sure, we can look into it. Yeah, for sure.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Irwin. I had a question for you about the position vacancies. We're tracking fairly high in revenue from that, or unspent money, I guess. Mm-hmm. And what does that actually do to the organization when we're looking in the positive with position vacancies? Are we able to backfill those positions fairly quickly? I mean, is that money going to be actually spent by the end of the year with backfilling?
Certainly not all of it. I'll let Lisa.
Excellent question, Councillor Sanford. So we have historically asked managers to check in with their general managers or with the CAO before backfilling a position to ensure, because we want to make sure that we at least accumulate the $200,000 in budgeted slippage in salary, wages, and benefits. But as we are starting to see that we're trending better than budget, and we still have resource requirements in the departments, we are backfilling more quickly on those positions, but you tend not to spend as much. You backfill at a lower rate. Typically, a contract employee is at a lower rate than a full-time employee, and there is some lag between somebody leaving and being able to bring somebody on. So we are very unlikely to make that up in any way.
Okay, so we are capable of using some of that variance to hire more people when we need to, but
yes.
Not right.
But and it wouldn't be to add additional FTEs. It would be right. Just on a contract basis to backfill. Yes.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
You'll recall that often as part of the operating surplus that we talk about every year, it's made up of that. That's one of the... Back on the page 7, the summary of all units, just the, on the transfers and others, the second note that you have mentions that many reserve entries and transfers are not booked until the year end. So that's specific to that line on the revenue side, transfers and others being off by 840,000. That's because
Partially, majority of it is referenced on page 9 in general municipal, which the transfers and others is up by $638,000. And that is made up of that explanation there, the cash in lieu of municipal reserve payment, the discharge of the servicing agreement, and the $40,000 in for the Rotary Club. So the majority of that 800 is made up of this 600.
okay. And on that page, I had a question about the $80,000 discharge of deferred servicing agreement. What was that?
Geez, I don't know the specifics. I know it's Trisac Properties.
Pardon me?
Mr. Fark may know the details of that.
Mr. Fark?
So, as council may recall, when the development was done along Railway Avenue for the big development for the shopping mall parking lot, that big development with some residential, we had in place at that time a deferred service agreement with the developer for work that will be done on Railway Avenue. And that agreement placed on the developer obligations that would endure over time in order to essentially ensure a cost share of future infrastructure improvements required to service the development. Those obligations were secured in the form of a deferred service agreement and a caveat on title. And when the properties changed hands, the property owners wished to discharge the caveats in order to transfer clean title. And in order to do so, they had to discharge their obligation to us for the infrastructure commitments.
So that's specific to the Devonian property that just was sold?
Yes, essentially yes.
Okay, thank you.
And that's now flown into the reserve as well.
Got it, thank you. I guess one minor question on community social development roll up, the transfers and others, so that page 15, the variance in transfers and others is really just sort of an accounting thing?
Yes, very much. As grants received last fall for use in, because their year is different than ours, or the provincial year is different, so it brings it into revenue to this year.
I have one or two questions on the capital project progress sheets, page 26. Project 1705. Was that the next agenda? Huh. Not in my agenda, it isn't, but that's okay. All right, there is a D2, but I have that chart in the D1 report. I'll wait till the next agenda item. Are there any other questions on item D1? Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Irwin. I just wanted to go back to what Councillor Sanford was talking about with regards to the slippage, and I'm just curious in terms of how budget meets operations and like the real life of it. So are there any projects that council needs to be aware of that are going to slip in time as well with the slippage in an inability to fill some of these positions?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. I knew that wasn't your question to answer, but you're the point man.
So other than the ones that we reported to council at the time of allocation of the surplus from last year, where we indicated we would not be getting to some of the planning and development projects, we didn't have the sufficient resources to build on them, and then council allocated additional resources to planning and development, and we've now been able to hire those on. No, there's nothing else from an operating standpoint that is falling behind. There are some capital projects that, for example, the software implementation at the rec center is proving to be more challenging from a resource allocation perspective. So we have talked about bringing in some additional resources in finance and potentially recreation to allow for that full implementation of that software program to be realized this year. But other than that, there's none that I can think of. No.
Great. And I would actually echo what Councillor Krausert had said earlier about looking at the potential of creating a smoothing effect financially with regards to planning and development, because we know it's something that ebb and flows. And I was actually thinking the exact same thing this morning. I just wasn't smart enough to articulate it first. And obviously this isn't something that it's expected tomorrow, but it would be something because we do hear from the public, oh, there's no development, you should be laying off, but it's actually an opportunity for the planning department to plan when it's quiet and perhaps gain some ground in some of the projects that they have going into the future. So it would certainly be something I would be open to looking at when we go to budget next, if I'm still here.
Are there any other questions regarding item D1 then, the operating side of the report? Moving on then to item D2.
Oh, just need for the recommendation.
I've seen that slide before.
Do we need to do the recommendation or?
Yeah. Oh, right. So then I'll move Finance Committee accept the year-to-date financial report as at June 30th, 2017 for information. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Given there is no cover page for D2 in the printed agenda, I assume there'll be a similar motion asked for.
Well, we provided it for information. We haven't done a decision report in the past, so this is how we did it in the past.
So you'll want a motion accepting for
Do we need to,
information? Doesn't matter to me, yes or no?
Yep, we don't believe we need to. So.
Okay, no.
I will just say, just to set it up though, this is the progress as of June 30th. The column project spent to date is what's been posted in accounts payable. We had the invoice, it's been processed, not necessarily what's been committed, what's happening, the work that's being done. This is purely the finance number as of June 30th. The project progress is, the words from the department head, what's happening with the progress. So we'll just that, and we'll do our best to answer any questions you may have.
Well, you probably answered this question, which was from the first page of the capital progress report, page 26 in the agenda. Just 1704 and 1705, which are noted to be complete, but they both have fairly significant reduced spending.
Right.
Is that because the project was less expensive, or there's invoices that you haven't entered into the big sheet?
Exactly. Invoices pending.
Okay.
Haven't been processed yet. Things have been ordered.
Right.
Things are probably here by now, but
at the end of the day,
processed.
those likely will be on budget or just slightly below.
I imagine pretty close, these two for sure. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And one other question on project 1711, which is the Pumper 31. A lot of talk about U.S. exchange on those purchases. Is that still being factored into this budget item?
Yes, I believe it is.
Who's speaking over there? Sorry, Mr. Burt?
Yes.
So that 850 is still a good budget item with the exchange factored in?
Yes.
Definitely when we looked at it last fall, we had that, and not too much has changed since then, so.
Thank you.
I would think so.
There are other questions regarding the capital project progress report? Do you want to say something? Councillor Comfort?
Yeah,
I just have, this is probably better directed to admin, in fact, on the completion of the WorkTech asset management implementation. Does this mean that by year end, when it says project due to close this year, that by the end of 2017 WorkTech will be fully implemented, or are we then on to the next stage?
I'll attempt to answer your question first, and then maybe Mr. Fark can correct, or Mr. Rao could correct. At this point, my understanding is that the WorkTech project, there isn't anything further to implement at this time. And so we're be considering that the project is complete. But I'll turn it over to Mr. Rao to confirm.
Okay.
Yeah, I think what Mrs. Van Kamp-Pima said is accurate. But there was a couple of things that we were looking at. There's a couple of data audit type services. We're looking at hiring consultants to do that sort of thing for us earlier in the year. And the way things have evolved with the implementation process thus far, we don't necessarily need to do those things any longer. And we're not looking at additional modules or parts within WorkTech that we're going to be purchasing or implementing at this point in time.
So that means it would be fully operational in every department?
It will be fully operational with respect to how we determine we want to use it over the course of the remainder of the year. There are certain aspects of it that we may fall to the wayside in terms of things that we were trying to implement previously that we may not use going forward in the future.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Fark, you had something to add?
So I would just add to that. So this capital project and the WorkTech project, WorkTech is the software tool that was meant to facilitate the asset management program. So the capital expenditure to support that program will wrap up this year, but the larger asset management program will continue. So I don't know that we can say it is fully implemented or final. It is an ongoing work, and we have changed some of our expectations around what we can accomplish with WorkTech. Some of it we have done with other software, like the NAMS Plus software that we've implemented as well. So that larger project continues.
Thank you. Oh, another question from Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. On page 29, there's a reference to 1735 and 1736, the transit bus stop improvements and the bus storage facility. Were there some grants announced this summer that might affect those numbers?
No.
Not those particular numbers?
There was recently a grant announcement, but it was old news. They were just announcing stuff that had already been approved and already factored in.
Oh, okay, so it's already included in those numbers.
Yep.
It doesn't change anything here. Okay, thank you.
There are other questions to this report? Seeing none, thanks very much. Move on then to item D3, long-term financial strategy. Then Kamp-Pima.
Good afternoon, Your Worship, and other members of the Finance Committee. This is...
Yeah,
so,
Just on that very last point, I think it's important to note that some of that budget money is from grants. So that already is, some of that's already grant funded. Okay.
You're right, important to note. Okay.
Okay, all right. So the next topic, long-term financial strategy. So the recommendation is that the Finance Committee approves the long-term financial strategy as presented. That's the recommendation. That said, however, whoops, there's a correction that needs to be made. As I was doing the edits that were recommended by the Agenda Review Committee and others, I didn't catch that then changed the page numbers in the report. So, I'm suggesting an amendment to the long-term financial strategy document. The table of contents is located on page 37 of your package. The one I have up here is just modifying the page numbers to correspond to where those sections actually are located in the report that's before you this afternoon. So, to carry on, the vision is to have our town have a municipal government that we want to make sure that we're innovative, we're cost conscious, we're flexible, we're sustainable, and we want to make sure that all of that happens, especially when we're financially managing our capital assets. So that's the overarching vision. And as this finance committee knows, every time we talk about budgets and the money and things like that, I've been saying, we need to put more money into reserves. We need to put more money into reserves. But the question becomes, how much? And so I just knew intuitively we needed more. So that's why I started the work with the finance committee, and I started you down the path to get to today, where we have a financial strategy before you for consideration. So one of the things is, always attempting to reduce reserve contributions, because that's sort of the go-to position when you're trying to balance the budgets and minimize any tax increases. And without really a good understanding of what our current situation is and what we project our future needs to be, there's not a very good argument to be able to say, oh, no, don't, or, oh, put some more in. So, and we had really good planning documents in each of our departments, and those planning documents say, oh, you're going to need to replace this asset, or you're going to need to acquire this asset at this point in time, it's going to cost about this much money. But never have we amalgamated it into one overarching picture to take a look at everything. And that's what this work did. Took all the planning documents that are out there and pulled them together. So where did we start? Well, we started a long time ago, but one of the things with this council was on June 23rd, we met and we had a workshop. And at that time, we talked about a long-term financial plan. So that was 2 years ago. My, how time flies. And the purpose of the workshop was for us to develop an understanding of what is a long-term financial plan, and recognizing that it's sort of a long-term continuous process. You don't do it, check mark, done. It's something that has to change over time as you get different and better information. And during that workshop, we wanted to make sure that we had clarity of who owns the process, discuss the process, stakeholders, the level of engagement, how do we want to go ahead, and then we established a timeline on the work that we were going to do from 2 years ago to today. So, we were talking about a long-term financial plan. So, what's a long-term financial plan? So, the Government Finance Officers Association defines a long-term financial plan as a process of making sure that you're aligning your financial capacity with what your long-term goals are, and making sure that you're using forecasts to figure out what your future financial capacity will be and what it will be required to pay for, coming up with some strategies in order to deal with that so that you can make sure that you're achieving one of your goals of long-term sustainability for your municipality. So that's long-term financial plans. One part of that is a long-term financial strategy. So the long-term financial plans will be coming down as we continue to do our work, and it's Mr. Rao's area of asset management that will really start to kick in as sort of the next part of getting ourselves to a long-term financial plan. So what was the workshop timeline? Well, just to remind you, we were going to start out by getting a property tax policy together. We did that. We were going to then make sure that we had budgeted reserve contributions. We did that. We wanted to amend the debt management policy to add a bit more meat to the policy and provide a firmer framework for decision making. That got accomplished. We wanted to amend the reserves policy, which we did. And then the idea was to amass data so that we could then take the data so we could make projections as to how much money we thought we would need for future spends on capital projects, which we did. And now we're at our goal of developing a long-term financial strategy. So that's the end of the timeline that was set in June of 2015. Sorry?
What year was it we did the property tax task force? Was that?
That was 2012.
2012.
Oh. So, what's the purpose for doing all of this? So the purpose is to support and reflect and implement council's goals and priorities, to make sure that we have awareness of what our financial needs are going to be in regards to capital assets, and to stimulate action. So stimulate an action to develop a strategy to move us towards sustainability of our capital asset program, so that we're doing so with the best information that we have and taking a holistic look at things. So that was the purpose of doing this. So how did we develop? What led up to this document? Well, we've gathered the data as per the timeline, and that comes from all the different plans that were in the various departments. We determined what our current financial position is, and then using that, we tried to determine what the capital funding envelope is, some of the challenges, assumptions, and sensitivities. Then we projected what our 10-year capital funding requirements would be, taking that out of the existing plans, and then calculated the gap. Once we knew what the gap was, then we put some brainstorming of some solutions that you'll find in the latter part of the report under actions. So what were some of the challenges and trends that we have identified? One helpful document that sort of guided the work on this was the City of Calgary had a long-term financial plan, and in 2011 they had done an update of that. And I used that 2011 plan of theirs to help guide this work. And so that kind of helped me also identify some of the challenges and trends, because unfortunately Canmore is not unique in this area. Many municipalities experience the same types of challenges and trends. So one of the things is that we have few revenue sources, and the main one is property tax. And property tax, unlike income tax, it doesn't move with the economy. Just because your house is worth more doesn't mean that you're earning more money. It just means the house is worth more, and you don't actually have more money unless you sell the house. We don't want people selling their houses. But if we had income tax as a source of revenue, as people make more money, they pay more income tax, which then means there's more money available. Right now, municipalities don't have access to that type of tax. So we also have tourism infrastructure that we require, because we have a healthy, robust tourist industry here. And with that comes some additional spends that other municipalities may not necessarily have to incur, but we don't get really any tourism funding that goes along with that. We also have to build growth infrastructure before the growth actually happens. If we waited to upgrade lift stations and wastewater treatment plants and pipe sizes until we had a development going in, the developments would take forever, and they may not actually go in because of the extra cost. So we have to anticipate that, and we have to build for growth. The other thing is that we have a waste transfer facility that we've recently brought on as new infrastructure, as well as Elevation Place, Arts Place, the Canmore Recreation Center renovations, flood mitigation structures, local transit, the Legacy Trail System, pedestrian cycling infrastructure, and affordable housing developments. So all of those have required funding and will require maintenance funding, rehabilitation, as well as replacement funding in the future. As well, the provincial and federal grants that we have access to, they've changed, and there is no certainty as to whether or not they're going to continue. That's one of the biggest things. It's hard to plan when you don't know what a significant revenue source might be. And in 2017, the other thing is that we talk about over-contribution of taxes to other orders of government. So as you well know, property tax bill is made up of a number of components, one of which is education tax. And for the residential taxpayer, for the most case, it takes more than 50% of the tax bill goes to the education taxes. So just to give you an idea, in 2017, the town of Canmore remitted $16.9 million in education tax to the province. When you talk about money coming back into the community from the federal government, our municipal sustainability initiative grant was $4.7 million. So quite a significant difference between the two. I did not research how much went to Canadian Rockies School Division. I just looked at what we as a municipality received. If you look at that municipal, sorry, was there a question? No.
Councillor McCallum.
You. So when we talk about, we're just talking about provincial education taxes that are going to the provincial government. do you have a number as to what, sort of from an economic development perspective, how much taxes are sent to the federal government that come from this region alone, or at least from Canmore?
Yeah, and I don't have that number, but Ms. DeSoto was working on a tourism industry study. I don't know if you have that, or?
Nice big fat round numbers are fine.
Yeah, no, I can certainly look it up while we're discussing it here and report back so that I quote it. And the numbers, though, would be strictly from tourism spend.
Yeah.
That was the result of the economic impact assessment that was completed by our 3 communities, so I can look that up.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever actually talked about that super publicly, and I think it would be great information for people to realize, but.
Yes,
anyways,
okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, now I've told you all of the hurdles that we've identified before moving in. The next step was to take a look and see what our current financial position is, so you know where you're starting from. So one of the things is...
Sorry, I was thinking about that last slide. You spoke to it, but as a bullet point, over contribution of taxes to other orders of government. We're not over contributing, we're contributing what we are required to pay. I mean, over contributions might suggest that we're paying more than we're required to pay.
Yeah. So the choice of the words over contribution is one that depends on one's view. It's not that we're paying more than we're required. There are some who feel that what we're required to pay is too much.
Don't argue with that.
Relative to other municipalities?
No, it's kind of, they figure out, they split the pie just like we split the pie. They figure out what pie they need, and then they divvy it up between the assessment values. Yeah.
I think it's fair to assume that compared to other municipalities, we are contributing more per capita or whatever per unit because of the assessment value of the property.
Yeah, if you look at it on a per capita basis or per dwelling unit basis, we pay higher than other municipalities would in the province.
I'll get into that.
Okay, so our current financial position. So our general capital reserve has a projected balance to the end of 2018 of 8.9 million. We have that new asset rehabilitation and replacement reserve, that's at 1.6 million. Utility reserves to the end of 2018 are expected to be $6.7 million. And the debt room that we have is about $23 million to take us up to the 100% of our debt limit that was in the audited 2016 financial statements. Then something else that's interesting to make sure that one's aware of. So right now, annually in our budget, we budget about $1 million of current year taxes to help fund capital projects for that year. We get MSI capital grant funding of $4.5 million. So in the previous slide, I talked about 4.7. So 4.5 is a capital grant and 0.2 is an operating grant. And then we have from the federal government, federal gas tax fund, and annually right now, that's at $0.7 million or 700,000. So current position. So then, sorry, yeah?
Callum?
Sorry, could you explain to us how the federal gas tax fund is calculated for our town?
No.
Okay. So is it just like literally like a number out of a hat?
Yeah, I mean...
I was going to say that's what I was wondering.
With the information that I have, it would appear to be so, but I'm sure that somebody has a funding formula. I'm just not aware of what that is.
How it's, okay, thanks.
So once we knew what our current...
Sorry,
I'm sorry.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you. Just going back to the MSI funding, that was our projection for December 31st, 2018. But are we confident we're going to get it?
No.
That's one of the numbers that's, like the federal gas tax, we get that.
Not necessarily automatically, no.
No, but they do the calculation and it's more certain than the MSI?
Yeah, like I said, I'm not really familiar with what the calculation is of the funding, right. But it is based on something more solid than the MSI, because the MSI is calculated on what the province budgets to put into the pot for MSI, and then they apply a funding formula. So,
Right.
yeah.
But federal gas tax, they collect it at the pump and then they
Yes.
redistribute it, so it's
Yes.
it's a more secure form of taxation because it is redistributed out of taxation.
Yeah, the only risk is that less people travel or don't travel as far, or they buy less gas, so therefore there is some risk that that level won't continue.
Okay, thank you.
Or I guess there's a risk the feds may change the formula.
Yes.
Good. Good to know.
All right, so after I figured out our current financial position, I moved on to some assumptions that I had to make in order to do some calculating. So assuming that we'll do some adequate operating and maintenance funding so that we maintain the assets in the projected condition. If we start to cut back on the funding for operating and maintenance, that means the assets will deteriorate sooner, which means we might have to replace them sooner, and that will affect the calculations. I also assumed that the plans are wholly inclusive, that there wasn't something that was missed, which is always a risk. I didn't include any contingency for emergent or unplanned or new initiatives. I just went with what was in the plans. I excluded flood-related projects, and the reason for that is that those are considered to be one-off projects. We wouldn't anticipate that we would have to continue to do this every year, please no. And so I had excluded them. Utility projects were excluded. The reason being is that Council has prudently budgeted so that the utility departments are self-sufficient, that their revenue pays their expenses. However, when there are growth-related projects or sometimes other larger projects, we will take debt, so it would affect the debt room that's still available. So the only thing that I took into consideration for utilities was their impact on the debt calculations. I assumed that the MSI and the Federal Gas Tax Fund grants continue at their present level. Property taxes and their contribution to capital, which I mentioned $1 million, which is supposed to be 5% of the previous year's taxes, and the debt limit increases because debt limit's based on our revenue, and if our revenue increases, then our debt limit would increase. I made a 2% adjustment or assumption across the board for that. I assumed that currently we're putting $400,000 a year into the asset R&R reserve. I assumed that that continued. The interest income was excluded because, as you will see when we get to the projections, the reserves drain fairly quickly, and reserves are the source of most of our interest income. I projected cost with an inflation value of 2% per year, so I started that in 2019 and added that to the cost because the costs in the plans were in current year dollars. The annual general capital contribution is currently $1.65 million. I assumed that continued, and I didn't take into account any annual operating surplus that we may allocate to reserves, because the idea is not to have a surplus, is to try and do the best you can with anticipating what your budget amount should be. So use those to figure out where we were. And I'm not saying that all of those are going to be correct, or that all of those will happen, just that I had to make some assumptions in order to start to do some calculating.
So the assumption that the contribution, the middle bullet there, property taxes, contribution to capital, debt limit all increased by 2% per year, encompasses the expectation that general inflation will continue at about 2% a year. Is that
Yeah. So I thought, well, if inflation is 2%, then it would be a 2% tax increase to help meet that. Right. And then if revenue went up by 2%, and we continue with a 5% of the previous year's municipal taxes contribution formula, then that would also go up by 2% per year.
So it's not suggesting that taxes would go up 4% as an assumption, the 2% plus the 2%, that second 2% is encompassed in the first 2%.
That's correct. Yeah, I just sort of applied 2% across the board.
Yep, that's what I thought. Thank you.
Okay.
Councillor Sanford or Comfort, did you have a question?
Sanford, okay. Yes, I do.
So you mentioned, Ms. Van Campina, that the LTFS was developed using the City of Calgary's long-range financial plan, 2011, as a framework. Were these assumptions a part of that model, a part of this model?
Yeah, quite a few of them were. I used that as a starting point, and then applied it to our situation and considered what our situation was like. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So we have some assumptions, and with those assumptions then comes sensitivity. I assumed inflation was 2%. Inflation might be something more or something less. I assumed tax rate changes of the same as a change in the inflation value. Tax rate changes might be more or less, which would then affect our revenue, which would then affect what our debt limit is, etc. Also, we don't know what's going to happen with grant funding, so we're sensitive to the changes in that. We don't know what some of the unanticipated or emergent or new capital requirements might be, so there was no adjustment made to consider that. Changes to the cost estimate, so you may think the project's going to come in at $100,000, and then lo and behold, when you go and tender it, it's $200,000, which is more than inflation. It's just you're going with the best estimate that was contained in the planning documents at the time that they were developed. Changes to the utility rate models might affect, so if the utility rate models change and now they start to need tax support again, that would be another draw on our resources. And also, we didn't look at capital requirements outside of the 10-year window, which can be significant because there are and can be some larger ticket items that are just sort of out there on the horizon just past the 10 years. One example is bridges in some of our larger facilities. And in that case, it's hard in a 10-year period to save up all of the money that you would need to rehabilitate or replace something large like that. So just to be aware of that, it can be sensitive to what's just looming out there. You may have an average at around 11 million, and then when you add in year 11, it's now 13 million, just because you have a large project sitting out there in the horizon. So those are the sensitivities and all the warnings. So what were the results? Get to the meat of the matter. So looking at sort of the average annual cost, and in your report there are charts to show you how I calculated each year. But the average annual cost for years 1 to 5 is $10.7 million of all the capital projects that are in the planning documents. If I then add in the next 5 years and take the average over the whole 10 years, it jumps to 11.8 million. And as you may have noticed when you read your report in the charts, the last 5 years seem to have higher prices. One, for inflation, but there seem to also be higher ticket items in those years. The annual reserve contributions, so our current year tax contribution to capital funding and grant allocations, are a total of 8.2 million. Our average funding gap from years 1 to 5 is 2.5 million. So looking at how much money do we have available compared to what is the average spend in those years, we have a gap of 2.5 on average. And then if you add in the next 5 years, the gap is 3.6. So if you add that up over the whole 10-year period, the total gap for a 10-year period is $30.5 million. So that's a funding gap. Projected, if we continue to do everything that we've said in the plans. That's the assumption. Then we move on to solutions, and the solutions aren't just, go out and find $30.5 million. There's lots of other actions, which we'll talk about later on. So currently available funding sources, it became apparent, will actually not support all of our identified capital programs, and not to mention any unidentified and unexpected or new initiatives. So by 2023, looking at the analysis, our general capital reserve and our asset R&R reserves will be depleted. The full MSI and federal gas tax fund grants are used up annually, and the debt levels reduce down to a low of 54%, and then begin to climb back up again.
Councillor Carlsford.
Your Worship. So just to underline, which I believe you just said and mentioned, that this is without any triage of removing programs or projects from the wish list. Mm-hmm. If we just funded them all, this is what would happen if all the assumptions are correct.
Correct.
But when we actually go to budgeting, there will be triage, as I think it's strategy 3B is got to make sure we prioritize, just as we've done in the past.
Yeah, exactly.
Great,
yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, and that's a big part of the actions that come out of this. But like I had said, sort of when I began this presentation, is I've been saying, you know, we need to put more money away, or we need to take a look at our budgets, and we need to figure out, you know, do we do this now? Is this the right time? Should we do all of this? All of those actions are a solution. But until you sort of know how much you're looking at, then that will give you the information you need to be able to develop the actions and implement them.
So to put it in another way, this is really putting into words what we've been feeling we need to be doing over the last few years, because we've been needing to build up reserves. We've been needing to be more certain in our contributions and increase our contributions, etc. We know that we need to triage to keep debt limits from getting too high and from getting reserves getting too low. This actually just puts it into words, and it actually provides some vision around it so that we can actually see what it looks like, as opposed to some feeling that something could happen if we don't do this.
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so,
And in no way, shape, or form am I suggesting that this remain the plan.
right, and I think that's the reason I was at. Nobody should be under the impression that this is acceptable. This is being put forward because it's not acceptable.
Correct.
Right.
Yes. Okay. All right. So those are the results if we don't change what we've got planned. So what that tells us is the status quo really is not a viable option. So a way forward. So now doom and gloom, but there's some light. And this chart actually does come from the City of Calgary, and I thought it was a really good way to sort of frame the solutions. So basically what it talks about is in order for us to be able to continue to provide the infrastructure for our citizens and our visitors, and our overarching goal is to be financially sustainable, then we have specific goals in order to achieve those, with the financial goals being flexibility, efficiency, sufficiency, integration, credibility, and then we have 8 different strategy areas. So that's sort of the framework of the remainder of the report and how we begin to talk about the solutions. So what is financial sustainability? It's an enduring ability of the town to make sure that we can deliver the level and types of infrastructure that our citizens and our visitors expect, while proactively assessing and managing the risks, acceptable levels of taxation, and our fees. You know, one doesn't arrive at sustainability. It's a static process. As levels and types of infrastructure change, the community expectations change, the risks that are present and that we're willing to accept or not accept change, and what is acceptable taxation and what's acceptable fees change. It all depends on what the situation is at the time that those decisions are being made. So that means this document is based on the information as at this period in time. What it means is one of the critical things is it needs to be periodically updated. As you get new and different and better information, then we will make adjustments to the plan as we go. So one of the key things is we want to make sure that we ensure that we have adequate funding for our capital assets, the projects that we're going to do. So we have 3 different strategies underneath there. We want to make sure that our estimates of our future infrastructure spend are complete, and we want to make sure that they're sustainable. And then there are some actions underneath that are in the report to do that. We want to make sure that we're using the documentation that we have, the information in WorkTech, and the asset management plans that are being put together by our asset management coordinator and our managers. We want to make sure we update our long-term financial strategy. We want to make sure that we increase or maintain the funding that we have from existing resources. We wouldn't want it to go down, if at all possible. So we want to try and, with the changes with the Municipal Government Act making to offsite levies, we want to explore if there's an opportunity to move into more things we can apply offsite levies to, increase the contribution to reserves from property tax, whether that's a reallocation of where the property tax money is being spent currently. That becomes a strategy that's implemented at budget time. And we want to make sure that we match the volatility of spending with our expenditures. So, we talk a lot about don't use a non-recurring source of revenue to fund a reoccurring expense. So we want to be cognizant of that and try and match up. recognizing that there's life cycle costs and operating costs. So when we're making decisions about capital project, to be aware of what those actual life cycle costs are. Ensuring that development agreements and offsite levies provide sufficient resources to fund the growth-related infrastructure. Making sure that we're, trying to find ways to create certainty, flexibility, longevity in our intergovernmental funding arrangements, those grants we talked about. And we want to make sure that we emphasize the need that we're developing a more stable and long-term growth in funding that's sensitive to that. So another strategy is to diversify our sources of revenue. So some of the things like that is, additional revenue sharing opportunities with other levels of government, expand the application of the offsite levies using user fees so that the user or the benefiter pays, lobbying for access to tourism type levies or sources of revenue, partner with neighboring municipalities. As you may or may not be aware, more and more grants are being available for regional collaboration initiatives, so that might be something to look into if at all possible. And we want to make sure that when we have an opportunity to lobby for other sources, that we take advantage of that. Another action or strategy is managing expenditures. So we want to increase our efficiency in delivery, and we also want to make sure that we set priorities so that we're funding the most important projects, and we're not just funding everything, but what is the most critical. So we want to develop our asset management plans, life cycle, seek value for money, continuing our mode shifts. As Mr. Sarte has pointed out, it costs less to maintain bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure than it does to maintain and replace road infrastructure. We want to continue to practice. We take advantage, we're already doing this, is when there's going to be some road work, we take a look and see if that's the time to also do the deep utility work, rather than doing one and then tearing it up and having to do another one. So we're trying to make sure that we're efficient in matching the work. We want to make sure that we're trying to find innovative ways to procure the things that we procure. We also want to find sustainable and less costly ways to develop and design the assets that we have. We want to make sure that we're continuing to do the good job that we do as part of our budgeting process, using measurement tools to figure out with asset management and aligning our economic and population growth with the timing of projects. We want to make sure that we're starting to give priority to our asset R&R projects, rehabilitation and replacement. We have, in some ways, focused a lot of money on new, and I think it's time to shift our focus to rehabilitating and replacing what we have. So here's some sort of more firm suggestions. The idea, so that you can get an idea of what you're sort of using your reserves for, is change the reserves policy so that the general capital reserve is used to fund new infrastructure and the asset R&R reserve is used to fund rehabilitation and replacement projects. Transfer $4 million from the general capital reserve into that asset R&R, so that sort of gives a boost to the balance of that relatively new reserve. Reduce the discretionary capital contributions to the general cap to $500,000 for the next 5 years, and take the $160 and make that a contribution to the asset R&R. As well, the Fortis franchise fees that we collect each year currently are budgeted to transfer into the general capital reserve. My recommendation is to actually contribute those to the asset R&R reserve, as that would support that that's a priority. And then one thing to look at is to increase the annual property tax contribution to reserves and funnel that to the asset R&R. That doesn't necessarily mean a tax increase. What it does mean is you may reallocate your current level of taxes in a different way.
These recommendations would be discussed once council gets to whatever the budget process looks like this year?
That's correct. So we want to make sure that we provide something for contingency. So there might be major economic factors and forecasts. We want to do that to sort of try and anticipate what's coming down the line. And we want to factor that into our budget process. We also want to make sure that the town maintains a steady access to funds that we might need for unseen or urgent things. So one way to do that is to grow our reserve levels, which allows us to be more financially nimble should the need arise. One thing Council's already doing, and we should continue to do, is make sure that we're using our debt strategically, manage the level of debt, use it strategically to make it available in a timely manner in order to fund essential assets with long lifespans. You wouldn't tend to not use debt for things that are short-lived, more long-lived, with the idea being that the debt payments over time are paid by the people who will be using those relatively long-lived assets. And we also want to make sure that we're examining a wider range of debt financing opportunities. There's mixed reviews on P3s, but there might be opportunities to tap other funding sources. We want to make sure that we're also operating with prudent foresight, not saying that we aren't, but just to continue to do that. Consider planning for longer than the minimum required by the MGA. So with the MGA changes, they're going to require a minimum of a 5-year capital plan. We may want to consider making a plan that's longer than that. We may want to consider a 10-year plan. Continuing to integrate our business plans and our budgets, assessing longer-term impacts of our current financial decisions, so taking a look sort of further out when you're looking at financial implications, making sure that we're thinking about the financial capacity when we're making the decisions that we make. And we also want to make sure that we periodically update the projections so that we are up to date on our information. So we want to make sure we're always maintaining sufficient cash flow. So look for opportunities to advance revenue intake. So one of the things is the TIPS program. So right now, 49% of the people are on TIPS who pay taxes to the town of Canmore. The advantage of TIPS is it brings money in every month rather than one big paycheck in the middle of the year. Anyone who's paid once a month can tell you how challenging budgeting getting paid once a month can be, never mind once a year. Continue to support and promote the TIP program. Pacing expenditures to match the cash flow, see if there's a way to undertake the project so it kind of matches as we're getting the money coming in. And we want to make sure that we maximize our interest income. And we've already been doing that by moving into a short-term investing that we had not done previously. We want to promote and enable legislation, so utilize our TCA and long-term financial strategy data to develop asset management plans, pursue initiatives to be able to leverage that information that we get from developing those plans into a sort of a multifaceted decision-making tool. We want to increase coordination to make sure that we are getting the maximum efficiency that we can. Therefore, we want to make sure that we're programming realistic and achievable goals and that we prioritize them. So that's what comes into Councillor Krauser's comment about, the plan has all of this. One of the big things will be to take a look at the plan and discern what out of the plan gets done and when. So seek infrastructure investment decisions, make sure that it's strategic, that it's thought about across the organization or interdepartmentally. We're looking at it holistically, and that was the idea of bringing this plan together, so that it's not all these separate pieces, but bringing it all together so you can look at the whole picture. Coordinate department infrastructure investment priority lists. Identify opportunities to prioritize capital project spending, making sure that it's consistent with our principles and objectives contained in our planning documents. So that's all of the sort of the strategies and the actions that are contained in the plan. And so I'm back to the recommendation where it says, now it's sort of amended from what's on your agenda, that the Finance Committee approves the long-term financial strategy as amended. And I would welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Comfort, you had a question right off the bat?
My question is about assessment, like assessing how well the plan is working.
Mm-hmm.
So there's different elements that I know in the past you've talked about how you handle our investments, our stock investments,
right.
I guess, and then these other measures that you're recommending that we take, that we've come up with over the last while.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a process to sort of a tool or a process to assess how well we're doing in meeting our objectives in the long-term financial strategy?
Yeah, so there isn't anything built in sort of into the strategy, and it's sort of new for us. But what I anticipate, just like we do whenever we bring in sort of measures, is that will be part of the response back to the Finance Committee and Council to say, you know, we said we were going to do this, and here's a report card back to you. This is what we have done.
Okay, thank you.
Just a short question. I have more, but others do as well. Throughout the presentation, you referenced how regular updates of this or that would be required, and the last paragraph in the report suggests that administration will periodically update the strategy reflecting council decisions. And I'm just wondering if it would be better in the long run if we are more specific than that, like periodically could be, who knows?
So that's one of the challenges, is that who knows? So the plans that we have may be the plans that we have for the next 4 or 5 years until we have master plans updates and condition assessment updates. As well, inflation might start galloping, or it might start shrinking. And at this point, I can't tell you how long it would be until we have enough things have happened that would have an impact on the strategy. Especially because if you think about the strategy, it's not you're going to put $69.6 a day into, it's more of a looking at it from a holistic approach, and where the numbers come in are what's our current position, where do we think we're going to need. So until we have a number of plans change, there's no reason why we can't say relook at the plan every X period of time, but I would hate to miss some information where there's been significant changes in a shorter period of time and don't look at the plan because it's been dictated that you'll look at it every X number of years.
Okay, I mean, I appreciate the complexity of it. It's just this strategy and the long-term financial plan are going to be critical elements of future success of the town. And I just have to assume that future administrations will continue to give it weight and present it or speak about it to future councils. And I think it's a safe assumption that will happen.
Yeah, especially as the work continues with our asset management. So the next sort of step in the iteration of the process is to do the work on the asset management plans. And one of the important key components that sort of marries with that and comes out of it and helps drive that is a long-term financial strategy. So most places would put together their asset management plans first and then from that develop their long-term financial strategy. So I wanted to have this in front of this council first, so we sort of put the cart before the horse a little bit, but at least it sort of set a foundation. The next thing will be to develop the asset management plans, and then what my vision would be coming out of that asset management plan would then you would update the long-term financial strategy. And so as you start doing that, you update your plans, you update your strategy, and that would continue, and that would prompt this to be updated.
Thank you. Councillor Cresswell.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for all your work on this. My question, now comment, is along the same lines, is I do think it would be very helpful to see how this picture changes over time. And so I know during the budget process we often get the we always get the update on reserve levels, et cetera, debt limits and all that. But I would very much like, I would be wanting to see, if I were to see it, is how this changes over time. So even if it's not a total update on the strategy, which an asset management strategy would necessitate, but just to see how, okay, the decisions it made have changed the amount of debt expected in 5 years, and the level of reserves last longer, or whatever. Yeah. So I think that's excellent information to have at every budget planning process, because it really does paint the big picture.
And in all fairness, we really are providing that information at the budget time right now.
But not like this.
Yes.
And that's the whole purpose for doing this exercise, is actually, I'm looking at the pages 18 and 19, and, you know, in that area where you find the gaps.
Right.
And, you know, that put like this is exactly the sorts of information that is helpful to make those decisions and help one keep a very clear focus on the impact of decisions now, how they what they'll have in the future.
Correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Your Worship. Thanks for all your hard work on this. It's been a journey. I just had some questions about the document itself, and I made a list, of course, somewhere on my phone, which was because I was lacking a pen at the time. So one of the questions I had, I just wanted to be clear. So currently, we budget 5% of the previous year's taxes to put into our general capital, correct?
That's the plan, but we haven't been
We
meeting
haven't
that.
been doing that.
Correct.
That's the plan, but we
Yes.
haven't necessarily been doing that, and I understand that. So am I to understand that that number is the plan is that at tax time, we're gonna say yes to the 5%, whoever's sitting here, and then it's an additional amount that you're looking for to be able to beef up those reserves over the next 10 years?
Yeah, no.
No? Okay, I misread that. I'm sorry.
No.
I thought it went from 5 to 7, and I was
Yeah,
just trying to
no.
clarify that number.
So there's two things we're talking about. So there is the current year contribution to capital projects. So 5% of the previous year taxes, which is about $1 million, goes to fund current year capital. So that's in the budget.
Yeah.
Then there are other items in the budget, which are contributions to the reserves. That's separate from that 5%.
Okay.
So right now, we say the Fortis franchise fees go in, and the fire department puts money in for vehicle replace. So there's a number of things in the budget that are transfers to reserves. And what we're talking about is we would need to increase those transfers. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes. My next question is, on page 13, you talk about our assets, 373 million, rounded in whole fat numbers. Is that like all of our assets in terms of like roads and infrastructure and buildings and everything? Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that that wasn't an all-inclusive number. It's a meaty document, and so I had lots of questions pop up. And then on page 24, we talk about infrastructure expectations from visitors. And so when those infrastructure expectations from a visitation perspective, are we going to be identifying that when budget time comes, whether it's a capital project or an operating project, or sorry, an operating budget, that this is actually something that is expected by our tourists or visitors as opposed to an expectation from citizens?
Sometimes that's possible. I suspect that many times it's not a clear dividing line. We need this bench because it's for tourists who have requested it. We need that bench because it's from citizens requesting it who live here. So that's going to, I suspect, we will not be able to provide that clear line.
I think that I'm curious as to when and if, being optimistic, we get some more financial tools from the province to deal with, to manage our visitor population. Much like the offset levy model, where we identify a project and we say, this is due to growth and this is due to regular replacement, it might be interesting to see if that's something that also can be applied, not just for the sake of doing it, if it's something that's actually helps us quantify how dollars are being spent for visitor population in general versus on citizens. And I think that's just sort of to speak to, sometimes we hear that we don't do anything for citizens or locals. And I would counter that we do a lot of things for locals, and many locals are employed within the tourism industry. So anyways, that was just a question I had for the future. And then this is a dumb curiosity question. So 49% of our taxes come in by tips. How do the other 51% all by once a year payments? Or is that how the banks pay, is once a year, or do they also pay? If If only people knew, eh? They actually save money by paying it personally as opposed to allowing the bank to do it. All right, thank you very much.
Ms. DeSoto, you had a
Sorry,
comment?
Ms. DeSoto.
That's okay. I just thought, while Councillor McCallum was talking about the tourism services, again, I'd report on the numbers that I found in the tourism economic impact study. So the estimated annual tourism spend in Canmore by tourists is approximately $345 million. And of that, there's approximately $114 million in taxes generated. Only 3% of that tax revenue flows to the town of Canmore in the way of fees and other property taxes. 63% or 72 million goes to the province, and 34% or 39 million goes to the federal government. And then just further to the response Ms. Van Pima gave on teasing out the tourism-related aspect of a project versus the full-time resident aspect. You know, it's, I know the town of Banff, for example, when we were doing this economic impact study, they were able to specifically identify, you know, a handful of projects that would not move forward unless they received additional grants in the way of tourism support grants. So things like downtown washrooms, and other kinds of tourist amenities can be earmarked, but projects such as Bow Valley Trail, pedestrian and cycle movement, I think you could argue both ways. Yep. That it serves locals and visitors, so it's difficult to tease them apart.
Yep, and that's okay to
Yeah.
say, you know, this is a quid pro quo thing. Yep. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
This sort of report that we could spend the whole 2 hours talking about, but you've done a really good job of giving an overview. With an eye on the clock, I'm going to limit my questions or comments to just a few, and others can jump in again any time. So on page 8 of your report, you note that in the past, each town department has used various plans to develop their capital budgets, yada yada, but predominantly in isolation. So having recognized that, I'm thinking about ways that we can, the checks and balances so that doesn't happen in the future. And I'm assuming that this strategy would be one of those tools, and perhaps the asset management work. I mean, how will we be certain that in the future the various town departments aren't doing that work in isolation?
So we've already started down with the budget process, doing more of this, sort of making sure that we develop the budgets, and then we come together as a management group and we start talking about the budgets, so that is giving a sort of an overview or a lens looking across the organization. And then we now have our corporate strategic team, so it's the CAO, the 2 general managers, and the managers who report to the CAO, which includes finance, HR, and communications. And we take a look and we start to look at the budget requests from that holistic perspective. So that's what we have been doing. But then, as you correctly said, Mayor Borman, the long-term financial strategy is going to lend to that. The asset management plans are going to lend to that. So the work that we've started just sort of grassroots will now continue with a more formalized process, as you had suggested.
Great. On page 12, the bullet point at the top is notes one of the constraints, I suppose. Key challenges is the increasing pressure to minimize municipal tax increase. And you note that the town's residential property taxes are moderate on the Canadian scale. And I'll save for another occasion the long discussion I would like to have around that. But in point of fact, what you could have said, and it would be accurate, is that town of Canmore's mill rate is pretty much the lowest in southern Alberta. So it's far better than moderate on the Canadian scale. We'll get into that. Yeah, and ditto on I guess there's no point in rambling on at this point, but the work that we've been doing with the town of Banff and the town of Jasper in advocating for different sources of funding for several years, and the report that the CAO referenced, the study that came out of some of that work, this report, I think sections of it speak directly to that work, and we should, for what it's worth, share it with our provincial counterparts and certainly with the with Banff and Jasper. I think this really underscores what we've been trying to get the province to understand, or at least respond to in a more meaningful way. That's it for me today. Are there any other questions or comments at this time?
Just thanks.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for your presentation and the work.
Thank you.
And then I will move that the Finance Committee approve the long-term financial strategy as amended. And I'm going to be very happy to support that motion myself. I think in thinking about this term of council, this is perhaps one of the most notable and impacting initiatives that this council's undertaken along with administration. And I'm thinking impacting as in the long-term viability of this community. And the work we have been doing around financial sustainability and resulting in a number of policies and in this strategy has largely been unrecognized by the public. So, you know, off-leash dog areas or trails or whatever get a whole lot of anxiety levels ramp up, but I don't know if people really are that interested in financial viability. I do want to thank administration. We talked about it earlier. You did all the heavy lifting. While this was directed by council, your team particularly has done an incredible amount of work over the past several years. And this is one of the results, but all of the policies that finance has brought forward and the amendments, really stellar work. So happy to support the approval of this strategy, and thanks again for everything you've been doing.
May I have permission to speak? I want to thank council for the direction that they provided. I'd like to thank my team for all the work that they put in, and that team also includes every single member of the town of Canmore, because it was really us all working together to be able to put something together at council's direction and culminate it in today. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Krausert.
Thank you, Your Worship. And what I'm about to say relates very much with that and what you said and what was said at the beginning about financial legacy. I think that the work that was done on this and previous policies passed and the policies that we're about to consider is one of the best kept secrets in town. It's not big front page flashy stuff, but it's it really, this council working with this administration, in my opinion, has moved the financial sustainability and really solid position, solid financial position further than any other previous council. We have policies in place now that were never in place. We have a plan in place that was never in place. We have, we're looking into that long term, and not just with some feeling, oh, there's something happening in the future. We've got numbers put to it. The asset management work has been spectacular, and I'm really proud of that. And I hope that all of you, as you're embarking upon campaigns, will be espousing the wonderful financial work that has been done over this term. And I certainly will be very loud in defending it myself from whatever chair I'm sitting in. So thank you very much.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. I too will be happy to support the strategy. I really like the direction of setting up a maintenance requirement, because I think that's something we talk about at budget every year. Is we can't always be building new things without recognizing that we have to have allocated funding for the long-term maintenance. And as Councillor Krauser had indicated, the long-term the asset management strategy is also a very significant part of that. So we're starting to understand bigger pieces of this organization more completely. And I think the strategy reflects that, and I'm really happy to see that. So thank you very much for all your hard work and for pulling it all together.
Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. I too will support the financial plan, and I look forward to the opportunities that are in front of us. I see some financial tools that will come into play, hopefully, through the MGA and other things. Offsite levy flexibility, other sources. I see some really good opportunities we can work, and I look forward to working with the administration on those.
Is there any other discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried unanimously. Moving on then to item D4. Joe who? Oh, that's an old joke. You kids won't get it.
Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Rao.
Change that picture maybe, but Your Worship and members of the Finance Committee, I'm here today to ask that the Finance Committee adopt a proposed asset management policy FIN-009 and give you a bit of background and an idea of next steps with asset management at the town. So as you know, implementation of asset management at the town of Canmore is a multi-step process. The first step in that process was Council identifying asset management as one of its strategic priorities and recognizing a need to commit resources towards its implementation. Some of the subsequent steps that we as administration have undertaken in the implementation of asset management since taking that first step include things like working together across the organization to evaluate the town's asset management processes, the status of our asset management data, the feasibility of our asset management tools, the town's aspirations for asset management, and the available resources and technical capacity that we have at our disposal to meet those aspirations. Going through this process of evaluation in conjunction with the gathering and processing of the data for the 2017 long-term financial strategy has allowed us to begin to align and improve the asset management practices and processes at the town. The development of these practices and processes has also allowed us to gain an understanding of the higher policy level considerations relevant to asset management and the town of Canmore through both first-hand experiences, things that we went through in the processes of developing the long-term financial strategy data, as well as a bunch of research that we did in-house. Some of what is presented in the asset management policy was discussed in the presentation to Council of the asset management strategy in April of 2017. However, I think that formalizing and adopting the asset management policy is another step in the progression of asset management at the town, providing high-level parameters, guiding asset management decision-making, as well as providing an enduring commitment to the continued progression of asset management at the town of Canmore. Also, given recent trends towards grant funding becoming contingent on asset management processes, as well as provincial bodies across Canada beginning to legislate and or incentivize asset management processes, we're also working towards meeting some very probable future requirements in the province of Alberta. Upon adoption of the policy, the next steps in the asset management trajectory or journey will include further development of a schedule for the delivery of asset management deliverables, these being the asset management plans, the long-term financial strategies, and long-term financial plans. And you guys touched a bit about that in the discussion on Ms. Van Kuypema's presentation, and that's things that Ms. Van Kuypema and myself will be speaking about in the fall regarding the frequency and regularity of the delivery of the asset management plans and how that feeds into the strategies in the long-term financial plans. Other steps include development of the plans themselves for all the large asset classes and departments, development of asset management procedural documents for town staff. And because this is kind of the first kick at the asset management can for the town of Canmore, a lot of what falls out of the development of those asset management plans will directly inform the procedural documents that we use. And finally, we'll work to further integrate these asset management processes and documents with other aspects of town business, including capital planning, budget development, risk management practices, that type of thing. That's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. Sort of a high level question is around discussion as to whether or not, I think the work is really comprehensive and well done. I'm trying to understand why it's a policy rather than a guideline or strategy or some other type of document. I mean, typically policies are more directive than this. And I happen to note in one of the other reports, the tangible capital assets policy, that notes our policy guidelines state the policies will address what the rule is and not how to implement the rule. So just could you speak to that?
Yeah, we did have a bit more sort of procedural content in the first draft of the policy, and based on discussion with other managers, it was recommended that sort of specific directive procedural stuff be removed and included in administrative procedural documents. That's...
Ms. Van Kuypema?
Yeah, so that was also part of the discussion is, do we even need a policy? You know, it seems to be so high-arching, overarching. One of the main reasons why the recommendation was to continue and to bring a policy for your consideration was that a lot of the grants that are tied into asset management, they require a policy. And so I know it sounds like you're just jumping through hoops, but we want to make sure that we haven't put ourselves at any disadvantage when it comes to grants by not having a policy.
Good to know. Thank you. And I think that's all I need to know. Thank you. Are there questions for Mr. Rao regarding the report or the policy? Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Mr. Rao, for your presentation. There's a statement in here that under the mission statement, 4.1, that the town-owned assets, condition of town-owned assets, and utilizes informed and integrated decision-making processes, optimizing asset useful life and life cycle costs, etc. How are we going to apply that to flood mitigation projects? What metrics can you use to determine the life cycle of projects and what the long-term costs are going to be on those?
So I think the big part of that is having discussions with folks in the engineering department who are heading up those projects, and getting an understanding of what they know about the structures that they're project managing being built, and sort of the life cycle costs that they expect based on input from any consultants and contractors that they're using on those projects. It's a tough one because I don't think we have a lot of history with flood mitigation structure and the operational and maintenance costs in the long term. So it's something that it'll be a bit of a learning process for us to establish those life cycle costs and operational costs. Yeah.
But that's going to be under the asset management plan as well, right?
There will be financial information about those costs. Some of it may be pretty big assumptions, but yeah, it will be captured, and it was captured in this round of data collected for the long-term financial strategy. It just wasn't used in this particular portion or particular iteration of the strategy.
Okay, so it will be under that department, the asset management.
Correct. Yeah.
Will be.
Yeah, we will be capturing that data and including it in asset management calculations at an organizational level.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Are there questions at this time from members of the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much for your report.
Thank you.
And the work you've done. Then I'll move that the Finance Committee approve Asset Management Policy FIN-009 as presented. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on to item D5, the Reserves Policy Amendments. There's no photo overhead here?
Good afternoon.
Just so we know who it is that's talking.
Yeah, there you go. I didn't, you see I didn't include my own picture.
No.
So the next item for discussion is the reserves policy. So as a result of the work that Council's been doing and the adoption this afternoon of the long-term financial strategy and the work of the Policy Review Committee, it has resulted that there's some adjustments needed to the current reserve policy. Nothing major, but just some of them to make sure that they dovetail with all of that. So what are the changes that the proposed reserve policy incorporates? Well, one of the big changes is that there's actually a new agreement in place. Instead of it being AIT, it's now CFTS. It's the Federal Trade Agreement that dictates how trade happens across Canada. So there are actually two. There's the NWTP, which is Western Canada. The changes are all coming in from the Canadian one. So we need to update that. The General Capital Reserve used to fund new infrastructure projects. Also in the current reserves policy, we referred to CBT, Canmore Business Tourism, and economic development documents. So remove those as that's no longer the case. Asset rehabilitation and replacement reserve, dovetailed with the long-term financial strategy, using that for our rehabilitation replacement. Move the franchise fees as going into the general capital reserve, move that as going into the asset replacement or rehabilitation reserve. We want to modify the wording in the minimum and the target reserve levels to refer to the long-term financial strategy. Remove a minimum target from a specific amount in the wording for the asset R&R and refer back to a long-term financial strategy. That way, as the strategy updates, then that would automatically update and wouldn't necessitate a policy change. Modify the rationale for the asset R&R reserve to remove a reference to the 2015 depreciation. So those sort of encompass what they are. Most of the changes you'll find that are in Schedule A, which is an attachment to the reserves policy. And the changes, Excel doesn't do it as well as in Word, where you can kind of see the changes. So what I've done is I've just kind of highlighted the areas that have been changed. So the recommendation is that Finance Committee approves the reserves policy FIN-007 as presented, and I would welcome any of your questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions at this time? Seeing none, thanks for your work and presentation. Then I'll move that the Finance Committee approve reserves policy FIN-007 as presented. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on to item D6, the budget amendments policy.
Okay, so this one has a bit more changes than the reserves policy. So what are the changes? Well, actually, the recommendation was to amalgamate the budget amendments policy and the capital carry forward policies into one document. And now all of the stuff is contained in this budget amendments policy that's before you for consideration. We modified the header information. We made the policy statement refer to best practices in general and not specifics. Add a statement so that we also encompass the capital carry forward areas. We want to remove any reference to annual budgets because, as you know, we had a multi-year budget, so just refer it to budgets instead of annual budgets. I wanted to, in there is we've put a definition for overall and for capital projects in order to add some clarity when you're reading the document. Replace total spending limit with overall operating budget limit. Just the wording is then more consistent throughout the policy. We provided some clarity within there. Service type and level changes must be approved by council, so that's been spelled out in there. And then one of the things for consideration that the new policy recommends is that the CIO approve amendments to the deployment of the funding for salaries, wages, and benefits. So in the current process, council approves this count of the full-time equivalent for the positions. And if that count changes, then council would approve that. The cost may be more or less if that count needs to change, but in the present policy, it's required to come back to council. The new budget amendments policy suggests that as long as the budget for salaries, wages, and benefits does not increase, that the CIO has some flexibility as to the deployment of those dollars. Other changes include some more clarity changes, so amendments can be made as long as the total funded from each source doesn't change. And we've put in a new provision, so if there's minor capital project overages, so we'd have times when a $2 million project was over by $148, and we'd have to do a transfer because of the $148. So we've put some provision in here so that we don't have to do all of that work for relatively really small amounts. Adding that all changes to an overall operating budget have to be approved by council, so we can't increase that operating budget without council approval. Again, a clarity provision, operating budget changes requiring a change to the amount of property taxes. That has to be decided before you set the tax rate for the year, which we were doing anyway. It just sets out that. Other clarity item is new capital projects or scope changes. Again, require our council's approval for that. Remove provisions around debt because that's covered in the debt management policy. Adding the carry forward provisions within the budget amendments. And then the changes to the carry forward project policy that are now in this one. It actually just provides clearer direction on how and when capital projects will be considered for carry forward. We also removed the responsibilities area as those are procedural. Provided clarity about how does emergency purchases work, and then moving it into its own section so it's really clear, and then putting in provision to repeal the two former policies. Brings us back to the recommendation is that the Finance Committee approves the budget amendment policy FIN 001 as presented, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you. I have just something to discuss, not necessarily a question, and talked a little bit about it at agenda review, and it's around the new direction in operating budget reallocation, indicating the CAO can increase the equivalent FTE as long as the total cost doesn't increase. And I guess one of the questions associated to that is would be that how would we, I think there should be at least some reporting on that to council that that's occurred. So would that be a normal part of the process? And it might be the CEO wants to answer the question.
That could be certainly part of a procedure that a report to council and the committee of the whole report is made, etc. One practical example, and we're seeing the necessity of it more and more each year because of the number of staff at Elevation Place and specifically the number of casual staff. So, you know, taking some of our casual staff dollars, for example, we might want to turn 4 casual positions into a full-time equivalent position. Those kinds of things, as long as they don't change the overall total budget and salary, wages, and benefits, we'd like the flexibility to do without having council approval on.
Sure, and I appreciate the intent and the need, but it's still a little niggling something going on in my mind. So in that example, for instance, that you just used, so 4 part-time become 1 full-time, and then the next operating budget or something, there's a request for 2 new part-time, and part of the justification is, well, we used to have 4 part-time and now we don't have any. And it's sort of lost that those 4 part-time became 1 full-time. And it's just sort of that tracking. I mean, while it's been onerous at times, I've always appreciated the fact that council made decisions on increasing the equivalent FTEs.
Yeah, and just further to that, I guess as we evolve and mature as an organization, having council fully aware of the exact number of, I mean, being aware of the total FTE count. When we provide you with an FTE count in recreation, for example, you see just a single number. That is made up of a number of part-time, casual, and full-time positions. So I think it's going to be more and more rare where council is well aware of the total number of staff in the various capacities in our departments, especially our larger departments. Certainly we still have a number of small departments where there's only a handful of staff, and those are easy to, and are more, I guess, visible to council. But in our larger departments, it's becoming a bit of a cumbersome process to require council approval.
Yeah, I mean, the corporation keeps getting bigger, and rightfully so. Tracking the impact on taxes and everything else from staff numbers and all that's important. But it's also important to be able to keep tracking how those numbers have grown. So there's a significant percentage increase in full-time equivalents in the last 5 years. That's made clear in some of our documents, but the fact that, I don't know, half of that is entirely as a result of Elevation Place, or perhaps more than half of that, that's sometimes harder to track. And I'm not suggesting I have any solution here, just I guess at the very least I would hope that in that situation the CAO would report to council as you've suggested, at least in the CAO report.
Certainly.
Are there any other questions or discussions on this item? See none, I'll move. Are we still on D6? I'll move that the Finance Committee approves Budget Amendments Policy FIN-001 as presented. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on to item D7, the purchasing policy. Catherine's back.
Oh, look at that. So now it'll make sense what I was talking about all those acronyms, and I stumbled on that previously. So now we'll talk about those changes in the Northwest Trade Agreement and all of those things.
Yeah, you were losing me there.
Yeah, so sorry. I lost myself too. But I found myself again, and now we're at the purchasing policy where that all now makes sense. So my apologies for the confusion.
Okay, figured it out.
So the Canadian Free Trade Agreement replaces the, I forget what, oh, sorry, I have it down here. Agreement on Internal Trade is the old one. So purchasing policy changes include that. With that, within the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, as well as the New West Partnership Trade Agreement, they both contain limits as to when you can make a choice to shop locally. And so there's been some changes to those limits, so those are reflected within the changed purchasing policy. We've beefed up some of the purchasing guidelines. We've added a new range, so right now it's purchases up to $5,000. And we thought, over time, the value of money changes, and so $5,000 today doesn't buy what it did yesterday. So at first we looked at maybe do we increase that level from 5 to 10, and then we sort of settled on why don't we get a new range so that there's a sort of a middle ground there, so that if it's a relatively small purchase of up to $5,000, we kind of still do the same thing, but to beef it up a little bit. So you got to get at least 2 quotes for anything between 5 and 10. So we beefed that up a little bit. I've introduced something called a procurement value, because what was happening is I would get phone calls from managers saying, is that limit on a one-time purchase? Is it all my purchases? Is it how do I determine that? So for the little amounts, we didn't bring it in, but for the bigger amounts, I brought in something called a procurement value, so that by introducing a definition for that, and then requiring those people who are doing the purchasing to follow that for the larger total dollar amounts, that actually falls in line with the new Canadian Free Trade Agreement. They have a provisions in there as to evaluation. So that's where that's coming in. And also in the designated officers bylaw, there's provisions in there providing direction to administration for when you're renewing contracts. So I just updated the purchasing policy provisions to dovetail with that. So CFTA replaces it. One other thing to be aware of with the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, before, when you would award a contract, you didn't have to publicly announce necessarily, you didn't have to advertise in any way who got the contract and how much the contract was worth, and now that has changed. We actually have to advertise that. So we've made sure that the purchasing policy reflects those new requirements. So just to let you know, those shop locally limits under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, goods and services over 100,000, construction over 250. However, the new West Partnership Trade Agreement has lower limits. They're at 75 and 200,000. So because we have to function under the auspices of both of those agreements, the purchasing policy reflects the lower limit. So, purchasing guidelines, this is an overall guidance for purchasing decisions. It adds some transparency, and it adds the idea of competitiveness to price. So in that area, dealing with the purchasing guidelines, pretty much stay the same except for those few changes. And that's always something that everyone's expected to consider, regardless of where your purchase is falling in the range. The first thing you should be looking at is underneath those purchasing guidelines and making sure that whatever you're doing is complying with that. So I did put together sort of a summary, because the purchasing policy is narrative and there's all these words around the ranges and what does it mean? So in this presentation, for goods and services up to 5,000, you don't need a quote, but if you've had the thought process as to how you decided that, you should record it somewhere. Between basically 5,000 and 10,000, you get 2 written quotes. Between 10 and 75, you issue an RFQ, a request for quotations or request for proposals, looking to get at least a minimum of 3. At $75,000 and up, that's when the provisions of those 2 agreements kick in, and that's where you can't choose to shop locally. You actually have to publicly disclose the award of the contract. So that's for goods and services. Construction has different values, but that sort of gives you a summary of what's in the purchasing policy. So procurement value, I've talked about that already. So basically, if I'm looking at a contract and it's, say, for example, assessment services, and it's a 2-year contract with a possibility of an extension of a year, I'd have to look at the value of that contract over that 3-year period and then decide, based on that, what I would need to do. If in the interest of it's not a contract, you just got to go out and you got to get brooms, and you always buy brooms, and you have to take a look at how much am I spending on brooms for the last 12 months, gives me an idea what I'm going to spend on brooms for the next 12 months, and then that will guide what I need to do under the purchasing policy. We already talked about contract extensions. It's per the designated officers bylaw. So the recommendation is that the Finance Committee approves this new purchasing policy or amended purchasing policy FIN 006 as presented, and I would welcome any of your questions.
Councillor Comfort.
So given that our, that Chrystia Freeland is down in the States now discussing the provisions of the Free Trade Act, would there be anything that would have to be substantially changed within this policy after those discussions come to fruition?
So right now, that they've just, like July 1st, they just passed that new Canadian Free Trade Act. So I would anticipate things would move very quickly so that it would change. And something else to consider is that the limits within that purchasing policy being recommended is lower than what's in the current Canadian Free Trade. So I can't say no definitively, there would be no changes, but I do think the possibility of having to make changes in a short period of time from now are remote.
Oh, okay. So would it have to come back to council then to be changed, or would that just happen sort of automatically because that's the law?
Yeah, as long as we're in, no, because you still have to follow, like, okay, so other legislation from higher level orders of government trump anything that a municipal council puts into place. That's it. So it would automatically trump those numbers. We'd have to comply with other legislation. However, it would make sense to update your current policies to fall in line with the other legislation.
Like the word, like the use of the word Trump there, Ms. Van Dyke.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
It's become a nasty word. Are there other questions or comments? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'll move that the Finance Committee approves purchasing policy FIN-006 as presented. And just speaking briefly to that, I will support it, and I particularly appreciate the update in the Section 6 on purchasing process. I think that's very timely. Is there other discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And finally, Ms. Van Kuypema is up for tangible capital assets policy.
All right, this is the last financial policy to run through. Then you consider yourselves finished. So that's great. So the last one is the tangible capital asset policy, and as part of the work with the Policy Review Committee, it was recommended that this is one of the policies that needed some revamping. So sat down, I tasked my team to look at it, to make some recommendations. Then I did provide them with council's policy guidelines that were passed in June. And then we applied that looking at the tangible capital asset policy and realized the whole darn thing is procedural. So eventually we will have to rescind it. However, we can't do that today. So the recommendation is it stays put the way it is. Then once we have an opportunity to develop the procedure, at that time we would recommend the rescinding of the policy. The reason why we can't do that today is that there are a number of choices when it comes to accounting for tangible capital asset that are choices, management choices. And when our auditors come in, they're auditing to make sure that our books are in compliance with the choices that management has made for the accounting. They need measuring tool for that. Right now, the tangible capital asset policy provides the measuring tool. We can't take that tool away unless we replace it with something else. So I just wanted to report back to you so you didn't think that we hadn't followed what the committee had decided. So for right now, I'd like to leave it the way it is, and we'll come back at a later date with the procedure and rescind at that time. Any questions? Concerns?
I have none. Are there questions from other members of the committee? Thank you for that brief report.
Thank you.
And with that, I will move the committee. Is there a motion here? No, there's no motion. Well, I'll just, before we adjourn, it behooves me to, that's all, folks. I just, I can't remember if we've acknowledged the work done by Councillors Krausert, McCallum, and Comfort on the Policy Review Working Group formerly in the past, but I do want to acknowledge that work. I don't think it was It's probably a little bit like poking a sharp eye in your stick, but thanks for that work, because again, the result is really meaningful. And thanks to Ms. Van Kuypema and her team for actioning the results of the committee's work. With that, I will move the Finance Committee be adjourned. Those in favor, opposed, we're adjourned.